as I mentioned early in our conversation, that I need to do a process manually first, make sure that that's correct, and then digitally transform it.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with industry experts, specialists, practitioners when it comes to the topics of processes, our business processes, and data as well. And in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of inviting back a former guest who's already been on this podcast a little under a year ago now. So very excited for this conversation. Sam Holcman, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. And a lot has happened since we got together about a year ago, as I think we'll be chatting about today.
Yes. And for those that don't know, Sam's the MD of the Managing Director of the Enterprise Architecture Center of Excellence and the Business Architecture Center of Excellence, has worked with many of the world's largest organizations when it comes to these topics. So knows what he's talking about, and especially knows what he's talking about when it comes to the getting the fundamentals right. And that's the topic I wanted to dive into today, Sam, was we were having a conversation just before we got started here about many hype words that go around, and you hear all of these hype words or buzzwords, and people are often getting drawn this way, drawn that way. You talk to them one year and they're talking about this, that you talk to them the next year or the next month and they're talking about something different, depending on what the hot topic is. Talk to us about this, the last 7, 8, 9 months in particular, and what I guess we've been facing from a new wave that's been sweeping through when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Yes, absolutely, Daniel. It's the fundamentals are still there, but it seems like the I hate to use the word hype cycle, because it's not just hype, it's change for change's sake. So we throw terms, for example, like artificial intelligence or agile this and agile that, cloud computing, something that's been around for decades. And now we see, for example, cloud repatriation. People are rethinking these types of things. So the first question I ask, and I ask the audience to think about, is that when you hear these terms, whatever they are, ask yourself the following question. Yesterday, somebody called it X. Today, they're calling it AIX or Agile X. What's the difference? Show me the difference into what's going on. Because one of the great things about this broadcast is that it covers 50% of what we've been doing since technology was invented. In the olden days, we were called data processing, speaking of the fundamentals. And you know what we're doing today? Processing data. So all of these terms that are on top of this are sort of like throwing a little bit of a curveball, because as we all know, if we don't have the process understanding correct, and we don't have the data highly understood and qualified and quality, the processes aren't going to work. So when you're throwing AI or CI or BI or UX or Agile this or whatever it is on top of that, it's just going to muck things up a little bit. And I think that's what we're seeing. So one of the questions you asked was about, for example, artificial intelligence. And for all of us, we now are hearing the term hallucinations. Now, what is that telling me as somebody that's been around for a couple of days? Well, I use a different term for hallucinations, I use the word mistakes. So what's happening is that the processes and the data are making mistakes. It's not hallucinating. So we as organizations have to wrestle with these types of things. So coming back to the fundamentals, data and process.
That's great. And hallucination, when you say that, it kind of sounds like people are kind of It's a way of people passing the blame or shifting the blame, not taking responsibility, not taking accountability.
The technology industry has been protected. Now, why do I say this? And this is something that is very uncomfortable for me. I'm saying this in front of your audience right now to say, if we look at history for just a moment, who fixed, in quotes, the medical profession? Who got them on target? The attorneys. When you put liability on there, who got the accounting profession to be on the straight and narrow? The attorneys. Okay. Right. Is there a theme here? Who got the manufacturing professions straightened out? Attorneys. In other words, there is a closed loop for responsibility that says if you put something out there, by the way, let's look at the automobile business. An automobile's been in the field for 8 years, 10 years, whatever it is. There's a defect. The customer doesn't pay for that repair. The company pays for that because there's a liability. There's a closed loop there. So this is something that us youngsters in IT, and IT is very young compared to these other professions, are going to have to recognize that somebody is going to figure this out and going to come after us. And I think in some cases, probably for good reason. I think we've seen, some articles, most of us have seen some articles about the absolute deep research that's done that some of these social media outlets are causing physical harm and even fatalities for young people and others, cyberbullying, for example, and these terms. Well, we know that if somebody walks up in the street and punches you in the face, there's a consequence. But if somebody cyberbullies you, so to speak, fascinating.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm not trying to be a downer here, but just to be a little realistic where things are changing. And as technology gets more and more into our lives every day, some of the things that you and I as technology and system professionals, have to recognize. So if we're putting a process out there that somebody's following and it's not right, then we got a problem. Rather than saying, well, we're going to fix it and release number 1.9 or whatever it is. So
yes,
fascinating.
Yeah. So when you're talking about these hype words, buzzwords, or this change for change's sake, what would you say is driving that? What would you say is behind that?
We have two things that I think are driving that. One of them is, again, just the desire to make our lives easier. So there's a belief that if we get this new whiz-bang technological magic, it makes some of the pain go away. So some of it is, that's a desire. It's a human desire. And, I understand that also. It is a desire. I'd like to, do things more simply. The second one is a little bit more uncomfortable for me, and please notice I'm smiling, but I have to say it because you asked the question. And that's that there's almost a built-in churn in our industries. What do I mean by churn? We got to change, because if we don't change, we don't buy new consulting services. We don't buy new advisory services. We don't buy new software. So there's almost a built-in requirement for churn there for churn's sake. Now, we can also look at the debris that has occurred over the decades after this churn has occurred. In other words, these things that have fallen away. I ask, as Daniel mentioned in the introduction, our area of expertise is enterprise and business architecture. And I sometimes mention to our clients in the first day of, for example, in our training sessions, I said, please raise your hand if you've heard about Nassy-Snyderman diagrams or Warny-Aor diagrams or action diagrams. Now, I know I'm old, but I'm making a point here that people get on these bandwagons and it becomes almost religion-like until there's another religion out there that other people have gone to. But Daniel, as you and I mentioned, in our discussions before, ladies and gentlemen, fundamental. There's data and there's process. If the data is no good, it doesn't matter what the technology is. If the process isn't correct, it doesn't matter what the technology is.
Yes.
And so the analysis that we need to do is starting off with those two fundamentals. So no matter what we're putting on top of it, we're seeing that now, for example, in artificial intelligence. Think about this for a moment. Artificial intelligence, the engines are being trained on stuff. Notice the word I'm using, stuff. Bad stuff gets into that training area. Bad stuff generates more bad stuff, which generates more bad stuff, which generates more bad stuff. So, and we're seeing this. There was an article I was reading about mathematical equations being solved by one of these AI engines. The older engines were doing a better job than the new ones because there's so much garbage and trash being put in there. Now people say, well, how did that happen? Because there's evildoers out there. There's evildoers.
Yes,
and they're having a great time doing evil. So other than that, everything is wonderful.
So how would you say this churn that's happening or has been happening for quite some time? How would you say this churn impacts organizations? Because obviously you're working, or have worked across many organizations over the years, and you would have seen this in different shapes and forms and sizes. How does this churn impact an organization?
The impact in the organization is twofold. One is when there is something new, it's always our belief that the question organization should ask is the following. Listen very carefully. That's spelled HMMMM. Okay. Now, I'm not trying to be a wise guy here. I'm just saying that just take a breath, a cleansing breath, and say, okay. Now, what does this mean? And then within that, I ask the following question. Here's what I was doing yesterday, as I mentioned before. Here's what they're asking me to do now. What's the difference? Show me what the difference is, and frankly, what I missed. At the same time, what we need to do is to dedicate in our organizations a percentage, I don't care what the number is, 2%, 1%, 9%, to focus a group of people on looking at all of this stuff. But the rest of the organization needs to be focused on doing, as I call it, actual work, which is enabling your business strategy for your stakeholders. That's fundamental. That's what we're trying to do.
Yes.
Let's net it all out. It's not the technology. It's not this. It's not that. It's you have a set of stakeholders, set of clients, set of customers, whatever you want to call them. You have a certain product or service that you're offering. That's the concentration. How do we make that better, faster, and cheaper in the eyes of the client? Not how many lines of code you got, not how many new engines you have in there that you're using, not how big your data sludge is, data mart, whatever it is. But I do believe, there's good and neat stuff out there. I don't think many of us are using quill pens anymore.
Right.
And so it's not that I'm anti, technology. On the other hand, it's kind of important to me, as I mentioned early in our conversation, that I need to do a process manually first, make sure that that's correct, and then digitally transform it.
Yes.
I think the fundamentals, as you mentioned, Daniel, are what's missing. The process, if it's not right manually, we're just going to make it worse by adding technology.
Yes.
So that's where I think things can help in getting back to the fundamentals.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing we have to recognize is that hype is going to continue. By the way, I have a master's in business administration besides a couple of other degrees, and it's from a very prestigious school in the U.S. And after about 5 of the courses during this degree program, I sat there and said, "What is this actually about?"
Right.
I mean,
right.
what is it actually? What are we trying to do? And we're trying to convince. All right, that's the one word that I left with. We're trying to convince people that what we're offering is better than anybody else. It's a convincing activity. You want to call it marketing or sales? It's convincing. And there's a lot of organizations and people that want to be, how do I put this? Convinced through confirmation bias. What does that mean? Everybody's going in this direction, so that's where we need to go.
Yes.
And so this is where I think we're losing our competitive advantage. Best practices are not on the internet. Let me repeat: best practices are not on the internet. Best practices cost money, and so if it's free, put your hand over your wallet. You know it's going to cost you a lot of money. So fundamentals.
Yes.
But we still have to look out for that. And if you look in my office and my desk, and you've talked to my wife, I've got every conceivable electronic toy in the universe, and too many computers and too many screens and too many this and too many that, because I love it all.
Right.
I love it all. So it's not that I don't use it, but I also understand. And the old phrase is what? Garbage in, garbage out.
Yes. And I guess to continue down that thought there, like we've got a lot of technologies everywhere. People are jumping from one technology to the next. How is this changing behavior?
The behavior change, I think, is summarized by the word hallucinations. When I started consulting, one of the things, unfortunately, we found out early that people use consultants for, was to go like this. Well, they told us to do this. In other words, it's a diversion from responsibility.
Right.
Now, consultants are also there, of course, to bring in, hopefully, some expertise that your organization may not have. So I'm not trying to be negative there. All right.
Yeah.
Now, human behavior is the same way. We see now the AI engine saying, well, that's what it produced. Daniel, I'm going to take you back decades, just to make a point here. I don't know who our audience is. I don't know everybody that's watching these broadcasts. But in the good old days of mainframes and data centers, the paper that was generated was green bar paper on a dot matrix printer, and these high-speed printers in the data centers would print out these stacks and stacks and stacks of paper, and it was all fan folded. And those green bar, light green, dark green, light green, dark green. I'm just giving you that image. And these things just spewed out, and it doesn't, whatever it was. And one of the comments, Daniel, I remember like yesterday, well, how do we know this is correct? And some of the people that looked at it says, well, the computer generated it. That was the reaction. And that's what we're seeing now with it. Well, the AI thing, that's what the AI thing said.
Right.
So it's a way to shift blame and responsibility as, and that's troubling to me. Now, of course, I'm being very general in a broadcast like this. I'm not saying everybody or every vendor or anything like that, but your question is valid. So behavior, we're sort of like, and that's one of the problems with AI. We hear these stories. It says, well, nobody actually knows what's going on in that AI engine. I have a phrase that I can't use on the air, and I think you know what it is. Okay. Somebody knows. Computer programs are zeros and ones.
Mm.
Somebody knows how it works.
Mm.
Remember when Bitcoin was invented? Some mysterious person, no, somebody, not mysterious. They could be mysterious because it's either being masked or confidential. Somebody wrote the code.
Yes.
Now people say to me, well, the AI engine is generating its own code. It's pattern matching.
Right.
It's not taking this thing out of the air and this thing out of the air and mushing it together and making a chocolate cake. Come on.
Right.
Everybody knows better than that. So the behavior change is sort of, and now we get into a situation, Daniel, where a lot of organizations are spending an incredible amount of time trying to figure out why their understanding is different than the AI engine.
Right.
Well, the AI said this, and we're saying, and now we're spending time trying to figure out what's going on, and there's no traceability.
Right.
There's no traceability.
Mm.
I want people to think about the airline industry for just a moment. As everyone knows, there's tragedies with airlines. Some of the airlines fall out of the sky, et cetera, et cetera. What happens after that? People sit down and figure out what went wrong. Now, how do they do that? Traceability and transparency from the blueprint, so to speak, all the way through the end product. If you forward engineer something, you can reverse engineer it and find out what's going on. And that's why I'm comfortable, and especially in my occupation, about flying around a lot, because I know that there is a traceable pathway from people's thoughts all the way through to production. When it comes to IT and its systems, it's construct, maintain. So we do have something to worry about. And that's that when something does go wrong, we invent a term called hallucinations. And that's because we can't trace to figure out what's going on.
Right.
But what I do want to stress to our audience is please think about what I said. Garbage makes more garbage.
Right.
And that's what we have to recognize. These engines are being trained on bad stuff, which makes more bad stuff, which makes more bad stuff. Now, what I hear is, yeah, but there's more good stuff out there to mask the bad stuff. I think most of us know that that's not the case. If we look at some of these things going on,
yes,
we know that there's evildoers out there that are on purpose filling this thing. People are getting paid to fill this thing with trash.
Yeah.
That's why we suggest what we call EAI,
right.
Enterprise Artificial Intelligence. Quite simply, you grab that engine, you bring it in-house, you build a great data structure for yourselves, and that becomes your source of the truth. So that's something that people may want to think about.
Yeah,
but it is kind of fun, isn't it? It is kind of fun.
Yes. No, it's a very good point. I think that when you are working with data and you don't know the source of that data or how it's being mushed together or strung together, you got to take it with a grain of salt in some respects, and so I think it can certainly trip people up. And I know you mentioned to me one of your all-time favorite technologists said something recently, or I'm not sure if it was recently, no, it's a while ago now, but maybe you can share that and the thinking behind I guess her thinking around that. This was obviously back in we're talking about Apple here with the CEO Tim Cook.
Yep, sure. Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing right now, and I think we're going to see this with artificial intelligence, is when you're saying change in behavior. If some of you remember, Apple announced a new product about a decade ago, maybe a little longer, called Apple Music. And Tim Cook, Mr. Cook, the CEO of the company, put a beautiful video together and said, ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to announce this new product called Apple Music. And we are going to provide this to you, to our stakeholders, at no cost for 90 days. So you can try this out. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Now, once again, let's take a breath. What does Apple have at that particular point in time? They have the pipe. They have the pipe. They don't have what goes through the pipe, which is the music. All right? Now, a high technology lady that I think most of you know, have heard of, her name is Taylor Swift, gets on her little computer and that evening writes an email to Tim Cook. And it's out on the internet if you want to go you see it. And the first line of her email is, I want to tell you why I am withholding my album 1989 from your service. Now, she said it very nicely, but what was she saying to Tim Cook? Don't even think about putting my album on your service. And she writes a beautiful email about, it's not me, I'm not the crybaby. She didn't say it this way, but I'm going to say it. I have enough funds to keep going. But it's those one-hit wonders, the people that make, one song and 90 days later it disappears, they're not getting paid. So let's take you down to the bottom of that email, which is the most brilliant two phrases that I want to leave with you in thinking about the changes that are going on. First sentence at the last paragraph. We don't ask you for free iPhones. Please don't ask us for our music for no compensation. Wow. So the intellectual property is what you and I are going into. So the AI engines, like we're talking about them, intellectual property theft. You can't call it anything else. So Taylor Swift wrote this incredible email and made that analogy. Let's think about that analogy for a moment. We don't ask you for free iPhones. Please don't ask us for our intellectual property at no cost. Very powerful thought process. And we see some movement at the time of this broadcast by governments. Unfortunately, industry is trying to ignore it in most cases because they cost money. And so some governments are now pushing back. And what's not surprising to me is that these vendors are pushing back against the government, saying, okay, we won't give you this. We'll see how that standoff occurs after a while. Interesting times.
It is. No, Sam, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today. It's been a very insightful conversation. I think a much needed conversation. I think one that the audience will have gleaned a lot from. And it's definitely eye-opening and good for us to ask these questions. Why, and try and find out the why behind the things that we're doing or the technologies that we're using or the emphasis or the emphasis on certain different topics or technologies or things like that, and why should we be considering that? Why should we care about that? We don't want to just make decisions because we saw someone else do it or because there's a big group moving in that direction. We actually want to use our critical thinking and think through and understand clearly why are we making these decisions as well when it comes to various technologies and various waves that move through our organizations. But I just want to thank you for sitting down with me, have this conversation today. It's been an absolute privilege.
Thank you again for the opportunity. And Daniel, to the audience, let's think the fundamentals. Remember what we were called years ago, data processing? You know what we're doing today? Processing data. Thank you again for having me again. Hopefully the audience got some interesting thoughts there. And in closing from my side, I love technology. I just want to be a little cautious.